So system forecast. So when we're starting this process, we've gathered our data. Really what we're talking about doing in here is evaluating the effects of past months, meaning we had a consensus forecast that was in place. We're now into a new month. We have all of our actual sales. The objective in here is to really evaluate whether we were on target or off. Did we forecast too much, too little, or were we spot on? So in there, what we're typically the output from one of these situations is we may make a decision that we need to go out and we have some historical demand adjustments to make, meaning, oh boy, we forgot about this. Maybe we had a customer that came in that's never bought from us before. Maybe they had a hard time with their sales. Well, do we really want to count on that moving forward? Because if a higher sales level, we're going to generate a new forecast, is that if that customer's not on board, we don't want to account and bring in more product to account for something that's not out there. Again, that might take into account the sales team. That's where we start collaborating and planning and looking at some of these exceptions. NPI process. Hey, do we have some new trends for some products? Do we have new products that are entering in? So new products that are coming on board. And by the way, this morning we had a group that actually does a lot of NPI, and they're introducing new products all the time, and it accounts for a large percentage of their overall demand. Well, when we begin accounting for that, what is the trending doing on this product family? How many new products did we have introduced? So that's a big factor in all of this. And then timing for the adjustments, right? So one of these adjustments going in, maybe we're doing some promotion planning, some other aspect. When do we need to make the adjustments for the overall plan? So these are some of the things that are going on within the system forecast. And I see, Jeff, there was another question out in here.
Yeah, it goes back to the capacity planning question, I think very similar to the last one. It says, does StockIQ have any functionality to project warehouse capacity, whether or not we will cube out?
And the answer is yes, meaning as we are looking at, let me back up on that response. Hold that question, and we're going to go in and we'll take a look at the capacity planning, and I'll bring that. So Jeff, if you can keep that as an open one, we'll address that when we get there.
Okay.
Alrighty, thank you, sir. Alrighty, so let's go into a little bit more detail, and we're going to talk about that. So with the system forecast and from the history perspective, we talked about a top-down process in here and reviewing the customer. Well, that top-down, and I've got a slide after this that Jeff put together that really talked about optimally when we think about a top-down. I would tell you top-down is really about saying, hey, we're going to organize all of our SKUs into a logical construct that makes sense. Maybe it's brand, it's product family, or something else that allows us to look at a grouping so that we can see what the aggregate trend is. For instance, maybe it's a customer slice. So if I'm in an omni-channel kind of a role where I have brick and mortar, I have e-commerce, maybe I'm selling through big box, maybe it's important for me to slice this data and begin looking at the trending within each one of those channels that we're looking at. That's typically where the sales collaboration gets in. Or it might be on the other hand where I'm looking at it from a product family. This is where marketing comes in. Hey, we're all of a sudden seeing kind of a downturn in this new product out here or this product family. Maybe people are migrating or gravitating towards something else. So again, when we're looking at these forecasts, how we organize the data really makes a difference for, if you think about it, the consumer of this information. All right. So one of the things that we want to do after we've seen that last month is we want to monitor the past forecast, period forecast, and the alerts. One of the keys on this, and this is the big takeaway, is you can't do everything, meaning we're going to have a variation in largely everything that was out there, meaning when we forecasted there's variation, we're going to be under or we're going to be over. So what we need to do is we need to think about how we're going to prioritize these changes, and we're going to begin looking at limiting the number of alerts that we look at, and we're going to Pareto them. Paretoing is essentially a way of saying, what's my top priority, second priority, third priority, etc. Now, you may have 30 of those that you need to look at, 30 items, but we're going to look at each one of them. Another way of doing it oftentimes is if our ABC stratification, meaning as we're ranking our products by an A, B, or C, maybe it's my highest priority that I address my A and my B-based items. So out of all of this, we will likely arrive at some forecast judgment overrides that we need to put in place. So one more slide, and then we're going to get into the software, and we're going to show some of these, where some of this data is. But I wanted to highlight in here for you in the Forecast Manager what a hierarchy looks like. So you will note over here, Jeff's put this triangle in place in here. And really what we're wanting to do, forgive me on this, folks, is we're wanting to come in and identify that optimal level. So start thinking about how can I get through this in the most expedient time, giving me enough detail that I know where to begin looking if we've had issues in the past, but not too detailed that I get lost and mired in too many details. So company level's too broad. Typically a business unit's too broad. A market segment's typically too broad. What's more helpful though, product families, maybe I have a brand, maybe I have a subgroup, something that I can get my arms around that we can start looking at trending, and it typically moves in aggregate. So that's a good one. On the other hand, too detailed a level, a SKU, customer location, maybe a color, a package size, or something like that. By the way, in this S&OP process, if we identify a variance in any one of these groupings that we're choosing to evaluate at a high level, we may and will likely go down into individual SKU level and look for those things that are contributing to the variance, right? So it doesn't mean that we don't analyze down here, but when we start looking, we look at that S&OP level. All right. Okay, so let's see here. Good to go into the software at this point, Jeff?
I think so.
All righty. Step number one, let's take a look at data. So within StockIQ, let's go into the Forecast Manager, and we're going to open up the Forecast Manager, and we're going to go out and we're going to look at this hierarchy and show you what that looks like. Okay, forgive me here. I've got too many screens open, and I'm having a difficult time getting at what I want to look at here. All right, in the Forecast Manager, this is our demonstration data. The way we have this organized is we're an electronics store, and we've organized our products under audio, cameras and camcorders, cell phones, computers, etc. So again, you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 5, 6, 7, 8 different categories that I can begin looking at. Now, in that grouping, if I want to see what the overall total sales were in the trend, you can see I see forecasted growth up here for my cell phone category is sitting at 20%. I'm displaying in units, but I also have the ability to come out and say, you know what, let's display that in revenue. What's our revenue that's generating on this particular grouping? Now, what's interesting about this is we saw an uptrend, but from a revenue perspective, you can see all of a sudden my revenue projections are actually down. Maybe we've got some pricing pressure or something else. But again, at a high level, everything looks pretty optimistic from the number of units that are being sold. But when I begin looking at revenue and margin, all of a sudden my trending isn't quite as good. So when we're talking about that analysis, this might necessitate a view of coming in and seeing what's happening, right? So this is one of the things that we wanted to highlight in here. But let's go back into the units, and I wanted to show you what this looked like. So one of the things that we can do to begin analyzing how we performed at one of these groups is with snapshots. Snapshots is essentially at the beginning of every month, or anytime we make a change at this level, we're going to record a snapshot. In this particular case, I don't have a lot of data oriented on here because we don't refresh every month, but you will notice that I've captured a forecast, and I've also gone back and I've compared against what historically had happened. So the way to read this is we're in June right now, and if I begin looking at where my current forecast is and I look at my actual sales, I have a positive variance out in here, meaning, hey, I was off by about 2,600 units, or about 10%, okay? Now, one of the things to note over here, if we look back 2 months previous to that, you can see that my forecast area out in here, I had a forecast of 23, and my actual sales came in much, much higher. So I oversold, so I had a large deviation there. And you can also see that I had a percent error. So in this type of a system, what we may start doing is going down and going, okay, I've broken this down into different categories. Well, let's look at all the various categories in here and going, well, what happened with my accessories during that same period of time? Yeah, I see a pretty big variance in that month. Well, what happened with home and office phones? Let's take a look at the current forecast on that one. Didn't have much of a variance on that. It didn't hit our limits in there of the 10%. Smartphones and PDAs, what's going on in there? Ooh, look at that. I had a 65%. I'm likely going to want to start drilling in and figuring out what's going on within that product category, right? Or subcategory. And by the way, I can go down here into this next grouping as well. We had a little bit of a variance on that, but it's not huge. I'm likely going to do some investigation or send the team off to go, hey, what was going on in here in these smartphones and the personal data devices out in here? Why did we see such a huge variance out in here where we under forecasted by almost 3 times, right? So this is how we start that process. This is one of the tools that can be quite useful in that overall analysis. Now, that's one of the ways that we can do that. We also have the forecast error. We have alerts that we're generating, and we've gone over alerts in the past. But let me introduce one of the other things that we like looking at from analyzing those past sales. You may or may not have seen this. It may not actually be available in your instance of StockIQ yet, but we've introduced this concept of unusual sales. So what are our unusual sales? Unusual sales are characterized as something that happened that I didn't expect to happen, that wasn't likely to happen, but it happened. Okay, so what we're really talking about in this is StockIQ will go out and it will allow you to identify where your tolerance limits are. We express those in standard deviations, so it kind of gets back into how many standard deviations do we want to cover, meaning I want to see everything that was unlikely to occur, maybe to like a 98%, which is roughly 2 standard deviations. So when we talk about that, you set these limits, and then what StockIQ does is it goes out and it looks, for instance, on these. You can see I'm looking at a specific item out in here. By the way, I have employed this tiered approach or this priority approach going, I'm zeroing in on just my A-based products, so I'm not looking at everything. You will also notice that I have sorted here on the quantities, the large quantities. So I'm looking for those sales that got alerted to me as an unusual sale. So a little bit of a sidebar, but I wanted to highlight that. So when we're talking about these tolerances, essentially what we're doing is we're going out and we're looking what our average sales quantities are, and we're converting that into a standard deviation. And then we're establishing where our tolerance limits are, meaning, hey, as long as we don't exceed tolerance out here of 3,000 sales, we're not going to create an alert or an unusual sale. Now, in this particular factor, you can see that we had 7,500 unit sale out in there going, what in the world happened? By the way, I also can control the demand date on this, meaning when we go out, we don't want to be looking back for the last year. I want to look at the most recent month, right? My data is a bit limited, so I went back into the April timeframe, but I found basically, an instance out in here, and this actually looks like a forward-looking demand, where I'm looking at a huge sale out in here going, what's happened? I've already taken into account, maybe I've pre-sold. I now have the ability to go out and sort and filter. I have an unknown customer. We don't know who this is. Maybe we've not sold to them before, but this is the overall order. This might represent somebody that usually goes to our competitor that's now coming in as rated inventory. By the way, this might have stocked us out to the point where we can't meet our other customers. Bottom line is we're looking for these things that are exceptions in our data. We didn't expect it to happen. We didn't plan for these large sales. Okay, so in this particular instance, by the way, we can come back in and go, you know what, after sales has gotten back and collaborated going, we don't know who this is. We don't want to plan for those additional sales because that could drive additional demand out. Let's go ahead and remove that from the sales. So when we talk about demand adjustments, we may choose to come out here and say, hey, this was an exception. And I'm going to record, I'm going to take that tribal knowledge now, that salesperson that came back in, and I'm going to say, Jimmy basically said, yeah, unknown customer, not going to buy again, right? Not going to buy. So all of a sudden now, I've taken that knowledge that's in the organization, I brought it into the tool, I've made an adjustment out in there, and I'm going to exclude this from future analysis, meaning I don't want to buy to this plan moving forward. So we can save that. This is what this process is all about, making adjustments to history. And by the way, every time we make these adjustments, when we're moving forward now, I have a new demand plan upon which I'm going to create my supply plan. Right? So this is what we're talking about within that step one when we're analyzing that data. And then we're also talking about how it's influencing that statistical forecast. Alrighty, so we just talked about demand and judgment overrides in that overall place. And let me take you into that next step where I kind of walked through this already. By the way, when we talk about some of these judgment overrides, these are really help us get to the point where we can arrive at a plan that's a corporate decision, meaning we as a corporation, we as a group of individuals have decided that this is what our plan was moving forward. We chose to go out and eliminate this data from the analysis so it's not being incorporated. So, okay, so we have all of that done. We're now talking about what needs to happen moving forward. This is where we get into collaboration. This is where we begin looking at sales plan, the new product introduction. All of these other aspects have been rolled in place. And when we're generating a new demand plan, oftentimes people want to see best case, worst case, and expected case. Expected case is what do we all think is going to happen? What are we all on board with? Now, best case is the sales team, or maybe the worst case, meaning they want to meet their quotas, so they're going to bring in a low forecast, they're going to sandbag on it. Maybe our product marketing group wants to look at a best case scenario. They're pretty optimistic about what these new products and some of their promotions are going to be generating, right? So they might come up with that best case. At the end of the day, we're really looking at what's expected. This is what we all agree to. It's a corporate decision. We're moving forward at this so that we can begin planning and creating our new plan from a supply perspective. So once that's been decided, we need to execute those changes to the forecast. So let's talk about how those changes get executed. Now, in a scenario like this, when we are working with product families, again, maybe we've decided to bring in a sales forecast out in here for my smartphones and my PDAs, and it's being brought in revenue units. Great. We can, by the way, make a decision on whether we like that or not, or we can make adjustments to it. But typically we would incorporate that in as a new plan that gets evaluated. So that's how that comes in. Now, when we're making that change, you will note that there may be an adjustment that needs to occur to that plan. We're going to adjust the operational forecast. That's this plan right in here. Let me get rid of a few of these others. And we're going to look at that dependent forecast. The operational plan is the consensus. Now, in this particular case, I really kind of like this because it's lining up with the statistical. You can see as we rolled up all of those individual forecasts, it's pretty doggone close to what we projected for this product category. But let's bring it up to the cell phones. And this isn't too far off, but you will notice there's some differences in this category as well. This view right in here, by the way, can help us make some determinations on whether or not our lower level plans are adding up to the overall aggregate. So really healthy. But should we decide maybe we want to make a change at this level and say, you know what, we've had one of our major competitors drop out of the market. We think that there's an opportunity in here to capture some of that market share. And we think that their inventory is going to be running out about the end of July. Maybe what we should do corporately is let's put in out of the remainder of the year and put in a demand adjustment of 15%. So instead of, if I apply this out in here, instead of buying to this forecast or that one that was closely aligned to the statistics, I can put some lift in here, right? So these are some of those things that are occurring in an S&OP meeting. Maybe it's a little bit of a gamble, but we all feel pretty confident in it. What this is going to do is drive more inventory on all of those underlying plans in there. So this is how we would execute some of those changes. If we save this, we're likely going to record some comments on it. It's the plan. It was what was put in place. And by the way, we're going to go back and measure whether or not we executed to that. So that was in there. Okay, so we've made changes to the forecast, right? Maybe we've looked at a best case or worst case, but we're in there. We have our expected. We've executed those changes. So what capture? By the way, just a couple comments around the value of collecting that collective knowledge. One, it allows us to get into the exception adherence, meaning, hey, maybe I made an exception for this person in the past or this process. Well, it allows us to go in there and begin saying, you know what, we're not going to bring in those exceptions that are outside of the group. So it allows us to keep those exceptions at bay. It's also cross-functional communication, meaning, hey, me as an operations person maybe didn't know about that specific customer that was opening up 50 new stores that we needed to supply into. So a lot of value in everybody coming together and agreeing on that overall plan. And then lastly, it's a historical record. We can go back and we can look at all of our plans that were produced. We're going to carry those snapshots and we can see exceptions. So in long lead time environments, we made a decision months ago and all of a sudden we're sitting on a lot of inventory. We're suffering service level issues. Well, the decisions today the results today were based on something that happened 6 months ago. That historical record allows us to go back, capture those notes, and begin surfacing what was going on. By the way, in this overall note, I just want to share something that this process, there's a lot of different parties that get involved in this process. There's typically an S&OP coordinator that organizes all of this and they organize all the people. Oftentimes it's an individual that's all they're doing in the process, meaning they're making sure the reports get developed, they're organizing the groups, they're setting up the meetings, they're doing the collaboration and doing the discovery. So a key element in all of this to facilitate this is the groups get united through an S&OP coordinator. That's a pretty common one. Okay, so let's see here. Now let's talk about step number 3, which is projections. Great, we have our new plan in place. We now have planned purchases and we have an inventory plan. So let's talk about some of those things that we're doing in here. So by the way, I'm going to go into some of these reports in here. We'll talk about some of these, the on-hand detail and the firm and planned, and we'll also go into that capacity planning. But let's talk about, forgive me here, I got a little excited there. Let's go back over into the tool and let's talk about when we create a new plan, we have a new supply plan that's created for each and every SKU that's in here. And that new supply plan is essentially a representation on what needs to be ordered. In the overall planning, I'm certain all of you are very familiar with this. What we're talking about now is this plan column, meaning what am I planning on doing to reach my goals and objectives or to meet that new forecast that's been put in place. So when we talk about the supply plans, we're really talking about this plan as a response to that new forecast that's been put in place. What are some of the useful things and how do we get at that? Well, one of the things that we're going to do is we generate what we call a firm and a planned report. And I might actually have one of these generated and we'll go in here and take a look at that. And when you know I don't, so we're going to go in here and I'm going to show you what a firm and planned report looks like. If you haven't dived into this one before, I can tell you this is really helpful. But let's actually take a look at this, and I'm not sure. I have a supplier forecast that's been generated. Okay, so I'm going to kind of cut to the chase right in here, and we're going to take a look at the supplier forecast, and we're going to look at the various data elements. By the way, in the supplier forecast, I like the pivot table that gets generated for this. From the standpoint, it's really easy to modify it. It organizes the data quite well. So we're going to explore this. But one of the things that I illustrated, and I kind of stepped over this, is I didn't have to go out and create this report. I have a supply forecast report that's already been built, meaning it's out there, it's ready to be executed. All I'd need to do to change the supplier forecast is potentially change the vendor that I'm looking at, right? So I can come out here and I can look either in the filters, or I can come out here and let me see, I think I actually have it over here where I've said, hey, this is the wholesale vendor. I can pick from any of the vendors and I now have a new report generated based on the data that I'm looking at. But in this supplier forecast, essentially what we're doing is we're looking out at a specific period of time. So in this particular case, I'm looking at Q3 and Q4, so the remainder of 2023, and I am looking at what I'm planning on purchasing from this vendor. you will note that I've organized everything under that supplier and put it under an item code. So here I look at the overall total number of units that I'm asking them to produce for me, and I'm getting it down to an individual SKU perspective. So they know right now what my plans are in place. By the way, this is really useful from an operations. I can collaborate with my vendor on this one. But the other thing that I can do is this is useful for finance as well. So maybe what they're interested in understanding is organizing that date by receipt date, meaning, hey, I want to know the implications to my finance plan from this. I'm going to organize all this data by the receipt date. And by the way, instead of showing quantity, I now want to see what my dollars are. So if I put dollars in here, and pardon me here, I just goofed this up just a little bit. I'm going to remove my planned purchases from this. I now know what my overall requirements to this vendors are, meaning, hey, at the end of each month, if I've organized this by receipt date, I know what my outlay is for outlay for cash is, to these particular vendors. I can go into my credit line and do different things like that. So the firm and planned report, this is a response to that. That's great news. By the way, as we're talking about this, let's also talk about on-hand detail. On-hand detail is all about saying, well, where do I think my inventory is going to be, right, at the end of these periods? So one of the things that we're looking at in here is I have some different views out in here where I am looking at the on-hand dollars on a project portfolio. Well, if I'm in a seasonal business right now and my season ends in December and I'm looking out in here and going, oh, what in the world am I going to be doing with all this inventory? And by the way, let's dollarize that and let's look at our standard cost to the on-hand balance in this overall view. I now know potentially how many dollars I'm going to have at the end of the season. So a lot of these reports from this inventory projection can be used by different entities in the plan. One more thing that I want to cover in here, and then we're going to go in, I want to cover the capacity planning, and so that we can get at kind of address some of those questions. So capacity planning, what's capacity planning all about? Well, capacity planning may be my internal resources. And in my internal resources, essentially what we're doing is we're going out and we're modeling this data by month. And one of the things to note in here is I am looking at everything that's been firmed up, meaning these are my firm plans, and then I have my planned quantities out here. What this conveys to is I'm going to compare what that plan is relative to the capacity that I have available. Now, if I'm in a warehouse, maybe it's cubes. And I have this in quantities at this point. My stocking unit of measure, again, is in units, but I could easily do cubes in here. You will notice that my planned consumption is sitting out there at 2620. By the way, this is what's making that up. Well, I'm only at 13% of my overall capacity. Not a big deal. Well, let's take a look at a scenario out in here where my plan to support this from a capacity perspective is going, wow, I'm at 267% of overall capacity. I can sort and I can filter out here and go, what's my single biggest violator right in here? Here this is right in here. I can see I've got an issue to deal with here because this is driving a lot of my overcapacity. So the capacity planning module is about helping us understand what we have the capacity to do or to hold, and whether or not we've exceeded that capacity. One more question go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was going to make a quick comment here. So when you're thinking about this capacity planning, this could be if you're making a widget in-house and you can only make so many widgets per month, this is something that you could use to model that to see then which month you're going to have a problem. I mean, traditionally, people that sell into the retail world have trouble producing enough for the sort of the holiday season if they just do regular production. Oftentimes they have to level load it and produce more than they need early on in the year to be able to support or sustain that inventory level. The other thing this could be used for is if you don't make anything yourself, you have vendors make it for you, and they can make so many widgets a month. You can do the same thing and put the capacity that they can make in here and model what their capacity looks like and look for the hot spots or those red areas that Jeffrey has there that would cause problems. The other thing that you could do, I'm not sure that it was designed necessarily with this in mind, but the question was, does StockIQ have functionality to project warehouse capacity? Well, if we put cubes in here and you had cube measurements for all of your items, then I would say you could do that. I would say it's maybe not optimized for such a thing, but I think it's possible, because instead of minutes, you would just be using cubes as the limitation or the limiting factor. Then one of the other questions was, seeing as capacity also accounts for time, does StockIQ have an internal calendar to account for holidays, company events, or anything that would prevent fulfillment of an order and production? And the answer to that is yes. StockIQ maintains 2 calendars. One is for each vendor. So if your vendor, the classic example is Chinese New Year, if your vendor goes sort of dark for a period of time and they don't make something, we can account for that with that calendar. The other calendar is an internal one, for holidays and such, where you're not producing or you're not receiving anything. And if StockIQ has that data, then we can help you plan around that. And there are a couple recordings. There's a webinar one, and there's one that Jake did as well, that talk about the various calendars and how to use them. And I think those are great, and you can put them on and put them at 1.2 or 1.5 speed and just zip through and get a quick orientation to how the calendar works. So that's how I would answer that question. And then there was a third question, just since we're on a roll here, that says,
Great job, Jeff.
If a purchase order is behind schedule, will the supply plan show that quantity in the month it will actually arrive, or the month it was intended to arrive when it was ordered? And so, Jeffrey, do you want to answer that? I guess I would say we can show you that. It'll be a different screen that you view that on, as far as your purchase orders being late. As long as you provide some level of update in the ERP system from the vendor, say, it's going to be here in 2 weeks or a month or something, as long as those dates are entered and we have visibility to them, we can put the pending supply in the right bucket for you.
Exactly. And we can show that. So when I was looking at all these firm and planned orders, I chose to only come through and show the planned dollars, but you will notice that I have firm dollars in here as well. By the way, one other thing in here, you will notice cubes are presented here. So if I decide I want to plan to cubes, guess what? And by the way, this isn't a great vendor because I don't have cubes associated with it, but I all of a sudden understand from a month perspective how many cubes are going to be generated. So that is definitely a dimension that we can insert. I think the report that Jeff was referring to was potentially over in the supply side. Is that correct, Jeff?
That's
Open
the
supply
one.
orders. Okay. In the open supply orders, I have the ability to look at all of those as to what the future receipts are, right? So I know when my receipt, I can sort and I can filter, I can look at between potential dates, and it's going to show everything that's out there. I have one other slide that I wanted to highlight in here with on-hand detail. In the on-hand detail, when I'm looking at this, one of the things to note is you will also note that I have cubes on hand. And cubes on hand could potentially be by the capture date. So for instance, on Amazon, you see how many cubes I have on hand. And by the way, in this report, you will notice that I'm projecting it out in the future. So hopefully that addresses that. Boy, this has been fun this afternoon, Jeff. I've really appreciated all the questions. I want to summarize this though, and we've got 60 seconds to do it. Bottom line, it's a process, as we've illustrated. It can be very beneficial for the organization. There's a great deal of commitment and discipline. Don't underestimate this. By the way, needs buy-in at the very top. That CEO does not miss these meetings, meaning they're not out of the office, so they don't get rescheduled. It's firm. That's showing real commitment.